Queer RelationTips, an iAmClinic podcast devoted to helping you, the LGBTQ plus community, create the love lives and relationships you crave.
Well, just take one word, for instance, just the word deference. Deference is not a respected male trait. Men see deference as weakness. And when I'm speaking to groups, I'll say, the first step of deference is to be an ally. And that means being fully supportive of the women in your world, saying, I'm here, I'm going to use the power I have to support you. But that's actually not deference. Deference is to take the next step to become an accomplice, or if that word doesn't strike your fancy, an assistant, to allow the women to tell you what they need you to do. And the pushback on that is consistent, to say the least. They don't want to, I'll think about being an ally, but whoa, wait, you want the women to tell me what I should be doing? Yeah, I want you to work at their direction. That actually is deference.
Welcome to Queer RelationTips. In today's episode, we welcome Paula Williams, a brilliant speaker with a background as a radio show host, college professor, public speaking coach, trans psychotherapist, TV show producer, CEO, clergy, and way more. She holds a doctorate and has millions of views among her 4 TEDTalks and is about to release a brilliant book entitled As a Woman: What I Learned About Power, Sex, and Patriarchy After I Transitioned. Her and I discuss the histories of trans women, the roles men have played in initiating and sustaining patriarchy, and the effects it has on women. She is a well of knowledge, and I hope you enjoy today's episode. Let's take a listen. When we were thinking about Women's History Month, I think one of the biggest things that we can contribute, as a podcast from Queer RelationTips, is the idea of trans women and women history, a topic that's often not included, I would say. And I think it's a very vital part, almost like a forgotten population in a very important conversation. What part of being a trans woman do you feel like is missing from the discourse of women's history? What's not being spoken about?
I think one of the biggest areas where we still are in our infancy is medical care, both in availability and even in people who specialize in it. You get a blood test as a trans woman at your own peril, or as a trans person, because some things have to be calculated as a male, some things have to be calculated as a female, and there are no trans-specific reference intervals. That needs to exist. There needs to be that, at the very least, is trans-specific reference intervals. I'm relatively smart, so I can figure out a good bit of stuff. But even I somehow had missed that our hemoglobin and red blood cell count has to be calculated as a female and drops 12% post-transition. And so I had both of my family doctors, one of whom specializes in trans stuff, who missed that. And, they were ready to send me to a GI guy to see if I had a colon bleed somewhere. And then, once we all came to, I'm the one who discovered it. We ended up with, everything was fine.
That's got to be very frustrating.
Yeah, the other is EGFR, which is kidney functioning. And that one is has to be calculated as a male. So if it's calculated as a female, it says your kidneys aren't working. It's calculated as a male, you're well within the normal parameters. Alkaline phosphatase is another. It drops like a rock once you're on hormones for trans women. It doesn't change at all for trans men. So yeah, there's a bunch of stuff like that I think is way, way off. I think the other major concerns I've got right now are the entire debate over the cisgender female experience, and that trans experience, even the controversy over the use of the term female and male.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. One of the thoughts that I have is, I think, related to your book, which I'm very excited to read. But the idea of, I guess it stems from one of your TED Talks, but the idea of the experience of being female and learning so many different things. I was at your first TED Talk, and I like the joke about why are the pockets of women's clothing so small? And that's one small thing that I think you've probably encountered. And I think as a trans woman, you have a very important narrative to contribute to women's history.
Yeah, it's almost all of my public speaking.
Mm-hmm.
That's almost all of it. And I did do a trans-specific event, but that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Over the last 18 months, all the rest of it has been on the differences in experiencing life as a man and as a woman.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's 2 chapters of the book committed that are committed to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there's so much to be understood by men, cisgender men, gay men, in terms of the experience of a woman, and I think that helping understand and being educated in this way could shift the future of women in the culture. And I think that makes us reflect on the history very differently.
Yep.
If we could do the work and see fruit from this education and seeing things change, what do you think, how would the future of women be different than its history?
Well, I think it's a massive amount of work that has to be done. Mm-hmm. And I believe that it's probably commensurate with the kind of work we have to do in the United States to deal with systemic racism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the entire world, not just the Western world, but the entire world has been built on the backs of women because it's patriarchal. Mm-hmm. Society to society, society to society. There aren't very many matriarchal societies. There's a handful, but not many. And so the work we have to do, I think, has to start individually and via narrative.
Mm-hmm.
I've been asked to be in an interesting group next month with, I guess, about 25 showrunners and writers for television series in Hollywood, and a number of transgender people. I think about 25 of us in the conversation. And the focus I think that they're expecting is to focus on trans-specific issues. And I have already said in what I sent to them that I think actually the best stories are stories where being trans is incidental. And the major part of the story is your experience as a woman. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or experience as a man, and how massively different that is from what it was in your previous gender or identified gender.
Absolutely. I'm imagining that this just has to oftentimes leave you feeling ridiculously angry.
No. I think the main reason for that is because I'm extremely aware of how much of my privilege I brought with me and how many decades I had that privilege and how I am still living off of that privilege, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so it is surprising more than anything else, but it's not been shocking. There are things that have been shocking, but that's not one of them.
Okay. Yeah. I would imagine the surprises are also maybe empathy provoking, having empathy in a different way.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, that has been a massive shift. I say in my memoir, there are so many times I've said to Kathy, I'm sorry, I just didn't know what I didn't know. And I had the opportunity to spend a couple of hours with my former executive assistant for 20 years. And it was actually a good conversation. She said, you were better than you give yourself credit for as a white man. But she said, yeah, there were blind spots. And I had to say the same thing to her. I'm sorry, particularly because she's a woman of color. And I said, I don't think I was sensitive either to the fact that you're a woman or that you are a brown woman, and how much more difficult that was for you in a particular culture that was very, very white.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You seem to have a very strong sensitivity to inequities and how the experience of them affects someone.
I do. It doesn't take long being socialized as a woman, and I'm rather fortunate, I think, as a transgender woman, in that in most settings in which I work, people have no idea I'm transgender, and so my experience is a little more typical of a cisgender woman than it is of a lot of trans women. And the amount of confidence I've lost in just 7 years, to me, is striking. Mm-hmm. It's like if I had decades of that, I'm not sure how much I'd believe in myself at all. Mm. I apologize for myself a lot more than I used to. I question whether I know what I in fact know that I know, as much as I used to. I think still the biggest frustrating thing is being treated as if you're stupid, as if you just don't know what you know.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a part of women's history that we don't talk about this month. It is not often the part of women's history that is discussed.
My first TED Talk, I have heard from women on all 7 continents, including Antarctica, thanking me for validating their experience. And I don't go through a week. Today I had 3 people contact me. 1 messaged me on Facebook, or sent a message request, 1 on LinkedIn, and 1 via email, thanking me for that first TED Talk. Mm-hmm. That's typical. Mm-hmm. Today's were from England, Germany, and another country, I can't remember which one. Mm-hmm. It's also interesting seeing the difference in different parts of the world. Women in Scandinavia say, yeah, it's probably not as bad here as it is for you there. And in Southern Europe, it's very much, oh yeah, it's much worse here than it is for you. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I can imagine. I was lucky enough to spend some time in Rome, and even being in a gay bar was one of the most gendered experiences I've ever had. Just so much, in my experience, toxic masculinity that it was almost honestly kind of frightening. I didn't spend much time there, and I can imagine how those gender roles are playing out.
And I've heard a lot from women in Italy, Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, particularly, and then also in Central and South America, about how just horrible it is.
I can imagine. Yeah. I often think as a clinician about the aggregate history of women feeling like they have to be small or apologize for their presence, and kind of the psychological effects of patriarchy. One of the things that struck me the most personally in my kind of attention to the patriarchy that I sustain is the psychological patriarchy. It's the psychology that subtly says male dominance is appropriate or it's right, and it's that sneaky implicit knowing we use to calculate and make decisions, to assess. And I was shocked to see how implicit and how effective that psychological patriarchy was operating even in my own internal narratives.
Well, just take one word, for instance, just the word deference.
Mm-hmm.
Deference is not a respected male trait.
Mm-hmm.
Men see deference as weakness. And when I'm speaking to groups, I'll say to men, I'm speaking tomorrow to a group that's 95% men in Canada. And I'll say, the first step of deference is to be an ally. And that means being fully supportive of the women in your world, saying, I'm here, I'm going to use the power I have to support you. But that's actually not deference. Deference is to take the next step to become an accomplice, or if that word doesn't strike your fancy, an assistant, to allow the women to tell you what they need you to do.
Mm-hmm.
And the pushback on that is consistent, to say the least.
Oh, I can imagine. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. They don't want to, I'll think about being an ally, but whoa, wait, you want the women to tell me what I should be doing? Uh-huh. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to work at their direction. That actually is deference.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm thinking of a book, The New Rules of Marriage by Terrence Real, where he says that men have to stop seeing the requests of women as controlling tactics and see them as legitimate requests for men to grow.
Yeah, that's really well put. I really, I think that's very true.
Mm-hmm. I think that it's almost, if the man on a thermometer was at 100 degrees and just boiling hot, and then he slides down to 70 degrees and he says, look, I made some improvements, but maybe the women in our world are asking for us to actually be at 10 degrees. Maybe that's where we're functional.
I think that that's actually true. I think that there's, as I've said in my first and third TED Talks, there's just no way that a well-educated white man can understand how much the world's tilted in his favor.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way he can understand that he got a head start, that he began life closer to the finish line.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we work hard, but that doesn't mean that it was as hard for us as it is for others.
Mm-hmm.
It's just it's an unfortunate reality. A white man walks into a room, he goes into a business meeting, he doesn't have to give up part of himself at the door.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't have to do any code shifting.
Mm-hmm.
That everything in that meeting has been designed for him.
Mm-hmm.
And so he walks into that meeting, doesn't have to shift his use of language, the tone of his voice, the accent with which he speaks, nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And he's the only one who gets that privilege.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think it's very frustrating when people like Jared Baird, I believe is his name, the coddling of I can't remember the name of his book, but to say as a white man that privilege doesn't exist in the world is, I think, proof of what you're saying here. Is
that coddling
yes.
of the American mind?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's and I think that's Jonathan Haidt, and I think that was written with Jonathan Haidt, if I remember correctly. But yeah, it's to me not nearly as interesting as his first book, which I think was right on point. The Righteous Mind. This one missed the mark completely, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, again, as a clinician, to think about a history where women were free to show up, where the world enjoyed, I like to say this word, enjoyed their spices, and saw female or women's spices as necessary to the recipe, this world would, obviously it would look so different.
I think it has to happen, or I think we potentially lose the species.
Mm-hmm.
You take the sociobiologist Edward O. Wilson and his work, or about eusocial species, which is based on the Hamilton rule, that there are 9 species that are tribal species, but one of them has evolved to believe an enemy is necessary for the tribe's survival. And where no enemy exists, they create one. It's the male of our species that does that, not the female. Women don't start wars. Women do start catfights. I think one of the things I've had more conflict with women as a woman in 7 years than I had with women as a man in 60. There is a lot of competition between women, but they don't start wars.
Right. I think another beautiful gift of women is emotionality. Of course, as a therapist, I put emphasis on this, but to watch incredibly emotionally wise and loving women in my life, and to see what they taught me and how they taught me, I think is an example of emotional intimacy that petrifies most men. And I think so. The myth is that women are more emotional at work than men, and yet the truth is men are far more emotional at work than women. The problem is the emotion the men show is anger. It's really the only one that our culture gives them permission to express. And of course that truncates the healthier emotions, though anger is also a healthy emotion. And women are more holistic. Part of that is that the average male brain, if such a thing exists, tends to fire within hemispheres, not across them, whereas the average female brain fires across hemispheres. So there's a whole lot more holistic thinking going on, right and left brain together, processing information and experience, sensory experience. Whereas for men, men do have neurons that fire across hemispheres, but it's kind of like trying to get across Manhattan, crosstown in Manhattan at rush hour, and not much happens. Everything is either on the east side or the west side. There's not a lot of crossover in the male brain. One of the interesting discoveries of transgender people, both trans women and trans men, pre-hormonal treatment, is that our brains tend to function about halfway between male and female. That on functioning fMRI studies, which of course there's some question as to how effective they are, but on functioning fMRI studies, they've determined that our brains pre-hormonal treatment never were all that male or all that female. They were very much in the middle. And then once you're on hormonal treatment, then you tend to go toward the gender with which you identify. And certainly I find my ability to feel and express emotion is far greater as a woman than it was as a man. But even at that, there are plenty of times my editor in the writing of my memoir, my editor Michelle at Simon & Schuster would have to say to me, I don't care what you thought about this. I need to know how you felt about this. Hope you're enjoying the show so far. I wanted to take a moment to let you know about a unique opportunity Queer RelationTips is offering. Over the past 10 years, I've sat with people and couples and walked them through some pretty difficult times. We all want thriving lives, but creating the love lives and relationships we crave is a journey, and Queer RelationTips wants to help you on that journey. We're accepting inquiries from those who want to come on the show and sit with a therapist and gain some insight into their struggles. Whether that's helping you find peace with your identity, ways to emotionally handle an unsupportive or critical family, help getting past roadblocks in your sexual relationships, or maybe ways to save your relationship that you fear is headed for disaster, we're here to help. For more information about how to become a guest, visit www.iamclinic.org/queer-relationtips. That's iamclinic.org/queer-relationtips. Thanks for listening. Now let's get back to the show. a piece of women's history that I am really grateful for. And I think it's how you felt as a trans child, a woman living life through a male body. That's another part of history that I think we don't really talk about or consider maybe often.
I believe that's true. And I think that, it's one of the reasons we see so many trans kids who end up with serious suicidal ideation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's still no diagnosis in the DSM-5 that has more suicide attempts than gender dysphoria, but it's such an issue with kids. Trans teens whose parents are not supportive have 13 times greater likelihood of attempting suicide than their peers. And of course, the suicide numbers are headed up for teens, period.
Mm-hmm.
So that ain't good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have nowhere to go. I don't think there's any trans child who has anywhere to go if they grow up in the evangelical world.
Mm-hmm.
Today there's so much more freedom, and
For
I think
sure.
it's a much healthier
Mm-hmm.
Environment.
Mm-hmm.
Still a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. Of course, you don't have to, but do you mind sharing how that felt for you? Nowhere to go.
I feel like I was, as I said in that very first TED Talk, when you talk to one transgender person, you talk to exactly one transgender person. In my case, I was not that trans kid who says if I can't live as a girl, I don't want to live at all. So I had zero suicidal ideation. For me, it was a disappointment to realize there was no gender fairy and I didn't get to choose my gender, which is what I thought.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't hate being a boy.
Mm-hmm.
I was just about as comfortable with boys as I was with girls. It didn't much matter to me who I played with. If I was playing house, I always took the role of a girl. And probably, I don't know, not every day, maybe every other day, I'd pray when I went to bed, please let me wake up a girl. But, it became more a mantra than anything else. It didn't become a huge problem until puberty.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was god-awful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I can
To
imagine.
have testosterone take over your being when every part of your brain is telling you that it's an unnatural substance
Mm-hmm.
is awful.
Mm-hmm.
And to not then have estrogen entering your body in that same time frame, it's awful.
Mm-hmm.
That was truly awful. I also was a very privileged white boy, living in the right part of town, in the right schools, with the right opportunities. So even then, it was clouded over.
Mm-hmm.
I was 16 years old and a rock and roll disc jockey at a commercial radio station. I was doing play-by-play of local basketball games. I was interviewing our congressman. So my privilege, I think, even then stopped me from really entering significant depression. For me, the depression didn't start until I was an adult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again,
I don't think I ever had any serious suicidal ideation until I was actually in my late 50s.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. When it was too heavy?
Yeah.
Yeah. So much powerlessness in the stories of trans folks.
There is, and I hear from them every week, and I'm a public enough figure that I hear from them. I'm just not in a position to be able to help.
Mm-hmm.
Very many of them. Occasionally something tugs at me and I'll have a phone conversation with one. But it is, it's every week that I hear from someone calling out, please help. And I send them, thank God, to any one of a number of places where there's a lot of support at this point. So one of the reasons I'm working with the LGBTQ faith committee with the Biden administration, that to me is, it's an important part of the work I do, because I think we've really got to reverse what we're going to see happen in pretty much every Republican state house at this point. The one area where they've decided to push hard is on transgender issues, particularly kids with transgender sports. And, we're just going to have to fight hard against that and try to get the Equality Act passed. I don't think we can make it as long as the filibuster rule stays where it is now, which is likely. But, we need it passed. The Senate is going to be the obstacle.
Right. Yeah. I just think of all of those little girls living life in a body that isn't in alignment with who they are. And that story is an important part of women's history, too.
It is that, and there's such a disappointing response of radical feminism to the reality of a trans woman's experience. They claim that it's just another way in which the patriarchy is trying to take over the world of women. And it's like, my God, if you only knew what our childhood was like, and my experience will never be the experience of a cisgender woman. I don't need to be reminded of that. I'm acutely aware of that. I don't see life in 28-day cycles. I see it linear. I don't have a uterus. I cannot give birth to children. And to have that world, the world of radical feminism, join with the extreme evangelical right in all of their opposition to the trans community is so disappointing.
Oh, it's so disappointing.
Yeah.
It's discrediting and minimizing in the least.
Yeah. Again, I'm fortunate enough that I don't personally experience it often, occasionally, but not all that often. So I'm not immune to it, but it doesn't affect me as much as it does others.
Yeah. Yep. I don't know where I'm exactly going with this next point, but I feel like it needs to be said. But to have a trans woman in the office, it's often, it makes me sad when some of the clients say, I feel like a fraud. I feel like a man who's playing dress up. And sadly, I hear that often, and I think immediately, you've always been female. It's always been true, even if the physical body didn't communicate that. And I think that that's such an important piece for trans folks. I just think that there's a lot of liberty in that.
Well, if you take a look at, one of the big points of opposition to the trans community is that post-transition, you still have suicidal ideation approaching 35%. Well, first of all, that's different than suicide attempts at 41%. But second, why? Why do you have that? And you look at it, 92% of transgender people are happy in their new body. So let's isolate the 8% that aren't happy transitioning genders. And look at just that 8%. 96% of them actually like their new body. They don't like the way they're being treated by society. Look at all the reasons for post-transition suicidal ideation. They're related to loss of family, friends, jobs, social status. They're related to the inability to pass. And the worst to the internalization of transphobia.
Mm-hmm.
And none of us are immune to that.
Right.
I find myself, and this is not good, but I find myself having to strengthen myself when I'm going to have lunch with someone who's trans, for fear that it'll be one of the occasions where I'm clearly identified as trans. If I've identified myself as trans, then that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
But to be read as trans, which generally doesn't happen to me unless I am in a group. And I actually have to strengthen myself for those occasions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have to get ready for that because it takes quite a toll. Quite a toll.
Mm-hmm.
Because you are constantly getting this world that says you're not really who you think you are.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that that's one of the most important things you can do with trans clients is to acknowledge that they will always the gender that they identify with, not the one on their birth.
Right, exactly. And I do want to clarify that I get sad in those conversations because the psychological patriarchy is so powerful that it's robbing us of understanding who we truly are and allowing that to feel comfortable.
Yeah, that might be an area where I choose to stay in a little bit of denial, because if I fully took it in, there might be a lot more anger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure. I think that psychological patriarchy in many ways is the pillar of homophobia and transphobia, but also internalized transphobia and internalized homophobia.
How could it not be?
Right? Mm-hmm.
I remember one of my friends who worked for an airline, who, when she first met me as Paula, she said, "Why?
Mm-hmm.
You haven't made as a man." Mm-hmm. And I said, "Cindy, but I wasn't one."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Her sentiments there are just so profound.
Yeah.
In terms of her history as a woman in a patriarchal world.
It says so much about her.
Yes.
And in her case, she is, I would say, an alpha woman. And nobody ever questioned my alpha personality when I was a man. Now, my alpha personality is quite a threat to both the men and the women in the room. And it's like, really? Seriously? If you take a look at Finland, Norway, Iceland, Germany, Taiwan, and New Zealand, all of those did very well in the first phase of coronavirus. All of them also have a woman as head of state.
Mm-hmm.
All of them are also strong alpha leaders. Strong alpha women tend to have that rare combination of great strength with great confidence coupled with great humility.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see that as often with cisgender men. You don't see that you see great confidence, you don't see it coupled with great humility. And again, that's because that's not honored in patriarchal society.
Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I referenced this earlier, and you've heard me speak about this, but I think when we consider the history of women, when we think of true equity, relational equity, it's saying, patriarchy made a decent meal. But in order for this meal to be perfected, we need the ingredients that women provide. Otherwise, we're still missing something.
Take a look at, it's horribly sad that we are the only one of the eusocial species, the tribal species, that believes an enemy is necessary for the tribe to survive, and where no enemy exists, we create one. And what we've discovered over the last decade, and particularly over the last year, is that as a species, we prefer our created enemies to the natural ones. The other 8 eusocial species gather together as tribes to fight natural enemies. They defeat them, life goes on. But we have 2 incredibly awful natural enemies right now in climate change and COVID-19, and yet we find that the male of our species is far more committed to fighting the enemies we've created ourselves. So you take a look at just those 6 countries, for instance, with their strong woman leader, and you take a look at how well those countries handled the first wave. And then you take a look at the 3 countries that were spectacularly and tragically awful, the United Kingdom and the United States and Brazil. And you look at the lack of formation in their leaders, not just the narcissism, but the toxic masculinity of their leaders. And hundreds of thousands of people died and are dying because of the difference between the 2. I mean, it's right there for us to see.
Right.
6 countries that have done extremely well, and 3 that have been spectacularly awful.
Right.
Patriarchy at its worst.
Yes, for sure. One of the things that strikes me is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of watching you navigate queer spaces as an alpha female and still feeling challenged, it makes me very frustrated that even in queer spaces we haven't got this down.
I was in a queer meeting and a board meeting, and one of my fellow board members just said at the in the middle of a conversation, "Well, you're an Enneagram 8, so you understand these things." And I said, "Actually, I'm not. I'm a 2 with a strong 3-wing. I don't have an ounce of 8. I mean, well, of course, everybody has all 9, but my 8 is not. No, but that is how. That was what was projected onto me by this person, because he had seen my 3 in action, which was wanting to get things done that needed to be done at that moment. That is something that happened in queer space. There's one story I tell all the time that happened in queer space where I was in a meeting and I said, we were talking about somebody giving a keynote speech, and I said, well, they don't have a lot of history doing that. But if you want them to give a keynote, I'd be happy to coach them. And a powerful white gay male in the room said, well, if we're going to do that, why don't we get a real coach? And I waited to see if any women spoke up on my behalf. They didn't, because women don't do this. What I wanted to say was, well, I've done 4 TED Talks, 3 that were recorded. I'm a TED Speakers Ambassador. I've coached TED speakers, TEDx speakers. I've taught speech in 3 universities, 2 in the United States, 1 in Europe. What part of that doesn't make me a real coach? But I didn't say anything because, then you're just that woman. And, and it was a gay white man and a powerful man who said it. And a wonderful guy. I mean, I have a ton of respect for him. But, one of the things you discover as a woman is you're not judged in the aggregate value of your work. It's assumed you're an expert in one area. And his assumption was I was an expert in theology. So how could I, in fact, also be an expert in public speaking?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I wanted to mention this queer space because gay men don't get any pass.
Well, yeah, honestly, I'm so sorry, Isaac, but honestly, they're often worse.
Yes. Well, I think that's almost, I'm just hypothesizing here or using some of my clinical experience, but I think that's the internalized homophobia that needs to use this patriarchy as a way of scapegoating to assuage their own insecurities.
And say what you may, in a healthy male-female marriage, the guy gets a lot of doses of, what did you say? What are you thinking? You know, I got 40 years of marriage of Kathy saying to me, oh, no, don't you dare. And, you know, unmarried or not partnered with a female, men aren't getting that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so some of that is just an honest social lack of awareness.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they need to have a close enough relationship to mothers or sisters or close female friends to be able to say, what am I not getting?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I still feel like I probably owe it to this person to say, do you remember when you did that? Because I do use it as an illustration. It's in my book. It was striking to me when it happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure.
The other side of the queer space is there can be a hesitance in the lesbian community to embrace trans women. I've experienced it, but not often. I've been more often embraced by the lesbian community.
Mm-hmm.
And on the whole, my experience with gay men has been positive.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were to compare the misogyny I've experienced, yeah, I'd say white gay men are a little bit worse than white straight men.
Yeah.
In my personal experience.
Wow.
That may just be because I'm around more of them.
Or we have some work to do.
Or, yeah, I mean, I want to be as generous as I can, but I think that internalized homophobia is in fact an issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest, all of us in that world have got internalized homophobia or internalized transphobia. You know, these are not taken apart easily.
Mm-hmm. For sure. No, definitely not. Yeah. I do think, though, in light of Women's History Month, that it's important for men to acknowledge the role that patriarchy and psychological patriarchy play, and to be courageous enough to set it down and to, as you said, let women teach us what they need and what needs to be done.
It's interesting, my third TED Talk has not been nearly as popular as my first. Because in the third talk, I point blank ask men to give up power.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And, you know, the first one's had over 4 million views, and that one's had, last I checked, about 400,000.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yes, I'm sure there's a correlation.
And it's also interesting to see that I haven't read the comments. I never look at YouTube comments because that's where the trolls live. But people who've looked at them said that men want to turn that particular talk into a talk about class. That I really wasn't talking about my male privilege. I'm really talking about my class privilege. Well, it's true. I did have class privilege. But no, you don't get to reframe it.
No, absolutely not. No. Yep. We are responsible.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Rewriting history takes some time.
It does. And I said in church on Sunday that I believe it is ultimately very personal. I think it has to happen one man at a time, one woman at a time. And men learning deference, collaboration, compromise, open to correction, and deep listening, which men don't do well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, men interrupt women twice as often as they interrupt other men.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sure, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, I'm really thinking about this a lot this month, trying to be intentional, but looking back over my development with my mom and all of the female cousins that lived with us growing up, and my aunt, who is my second mom, and my professional mentors, both of whom were women, and really being appreciative for everything that they've taught me, and then being courageous enough to let women be powerful, to let them play that powerful role in my life.
Yeah, and I actually think you're probably about as balanced as any guy I know. And I have always assumed that that was because you had positive female role models and possibly positive male role models. My father was a man who deferred to women, and I think that served me well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
He showed deference to my mother, and there was a lot of psychological turmoil there, but he showed deference to women on the whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's important. It's imperative. Yep. It's not just a kind thing to do. It's the right thing to do.
Until it becomes a respected male trait.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
We're not ever going to get there.
Mm. Mm.
You know, we're 100 years from pay equity, let alone any other kind of gender equity.
For sure. I think that's my intention with this series, is to challenge myself to be better than the average male. I don't want to just be average. It's the 3 in me, but with all sincerity.
I think that's completely reasonable. I think along the same lines, I want to keep learning and keep being aware as a trans woman of the male privilege that I have brought with me and ways in which it finds expression.
Mm-hmm.
I want to continue to be aware of those. For instance, you know, I said men interrupt women twice as often as they interrupt other men. I still interrupt others more than the average woman does. I'm very aware of it. It bothers me when I do it. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of those habits that come from being a man for so long that are hard to give up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awareness and I think courage. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the most unsung stories to remember and honor in the month of March as we celebrate Women's History Month are those of trans women. First off, I applaud Paula for being conscious to voice the ways in which she benefited from privilege before she transitioned, and assessing the ways it not only affected women, but also people of color. Secondly, I am so aware that during a time when we consider the histories of women in a patriarchal world, we must also consider the histories of little trans girls growing up with the fear of coming out. Those are women's histories we cannot forget. The ways in which men, overt patriarchy, and psychological patriarchy have silenced women is the same systems that have silenced trans women potentially allowing them to feel even more fearful to assert their truth and express their realities. For the most part, the majority of people would assume I'm cisgender. I have surely had successes and privileges that have allowed me to succeed, cross barriers, and access heights I would not have had access to if people perceived me as gender nonconforming or gender non-binary. And because the various privileges that my outward perception has afforded me, I have to acknowledge then the ways in which I have been part of the systemic, even if unintentional, practices of patriarchy and the rehearsals of psychological patriarchy. Paula calls us out, especially gay men, that we need to remember that we have stolen power that is not rightfully ours. We need to relinquish the perception that our power is right and acquiesce the fact that women are equally as capable, powerful, intelligent, and have many things to teach us, like courage, strength, and wisdom. We have to acknowledge that a team without women is no team at all, that a strategy without a woman's input is half-informed, and a culture without the influence of women contributing is nothing more than a culture standing on immature power and control. What can you learn from the women around you and their histories of pain? I promise you, you'll learn about a deeper strength, a stronger love, a mature wisdom, and a courage most men wish to possess. To all the women, trans or cis, your histories matter, and they are one of the most powerful agents we have to initiate our relational evolution. Until next time. Mwah.
Queer RelationTips is a podcast sponsored by iAmClinic, a counseling practice devoted to the LGBTQ+ community with in-person and virtual counseling options available. iAmClinic. Create the love lives and relationships you crave. Find us online on Instagram at LGBTQ_therapy and Facebook at iAmClinic. That's iAmClinic.